Forward. Music has a certain magic. It can transport us to a different world, drive us to dance, or remind us of lost loved ones. A single chord can reduce us to tears. Far from being an exclusive, elite preserve, the kind of music that provided people in the Western world with pleasure and inspiration for most of the past 1,000 years, and now commonly known as classical music, is still delighting listeners today. It toys with our emotions in our favorite movies, its symphonic swells add drama to the action of computer games, and it hides in the structure and melodies of everyday pop songs. Its magic is of a very special sort, one that has grown and evolved over the centuries, shaped by politics, geography, religion, and the particular genius of a multitude of great composers. Sometimes it's enough just to listen and let the music wash over and through you without asking why, when, or how this piece originated. However, the classical music canon can seem intimidatingly vast, encompassing many different styles and genres. For example, the early music of the medieval church, plain song and chant, is a sonic world away from the waterfalls of sound created by the 19th century symphony orchestras employed by Romantic composers, such as Tchaikovsky and Brahms, or the atonal experimentation of Schoenberg in the early 20th century. At times, exploring new sound worlds can be unfamiliar, or even a little uncomfortable, as the composer may have intended. With the classical music book, you will discover the context of the great musical works of the last 1,000 years. Understanding who the composers were and why they were writing can be a revelation and can add a new layer of enjoyment and insight to your listening. A familiar piece such as Vivaldi's Four Seasons takes on a whole new resonance when you learn that Vivaldi demonstrated the true potential of the concerto form for the first time and that his reputation spread from Italy to Germany, where he inspired a young organist named Johann Sebastian Bach. You might know that Beethoven was deaf later in life, but learning which of his works he composed yet never actually heard adds a poignancy and an increased sense of wonder to the listening experience. Realizing that Mozart was effectively an 18th century pop star might convince you to give The Marriage of Figaro another try. Power, patronage, and censorship have each played a part in the genesis of some of the best-loved pieces of music. As you will discover, the real-life drama and scandals often kept pace with the musical dramatics on the stage and in the score. These, then, are the worlds that the book you are holding invites you to explore. It will be an invaluable companion as it takes you on a journey through the different periods of musical history, deepening your understanding and appreciation of some of classical music's greatest works. It will delight those of you who already love classical music but may have never, until now, come to grips with the component elements of musical vocabulary and theory. And best of all, it will, I hope, encourage endless hours of new listening. Classical music, like all music, has passion at its heart. It's why the great works of the past have endured for centuries, why contemporary composers still strive to match and challenge that beauty, and why millions of us love to play, listen, and be transported by it today. There is so much wonderful, passionate music out there. Let this book open your eyes and your ears to it. Katie Derham, Classical Music Commentator. Introduction. A vital part of human culture, at least since Neolithic times, music has been a feature of every civilization, as cave paintings, frescoes, and archaeology show. What is loosely referred to as classical music is the music of Western civilization as it evolved from medieval times to the present day. In its broadest sense, it covers a wide spectrum of music and not just the orchestral or piano music that some people imagine. This book explores how classical music developed as an essential part of European culture and then spread across the world, delighting, surprising, and sometimes perplexing audiences as it evolved through the centuries. Bold leaps. The development of a musical tradition, from medieval church music and courtly troubadours to the avant-garde music of the 21st century, was often incremental, but it has also been punctuated by exciting innovations. The first operas, staged at the end of the 16th century, for example, revolutionized sacred as well as secular music, while Beethoven's Eroica Symphony shocked early 19th century audiences with its groundbreaking structure and disregard for classical conventions. Just as Igor Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps astounded those who attended its Paris premiere a century later. Such leaps have defined the main periods of classical music: early music, Renaissance, Baroque, classical, Romantic, nationalist, modern, and contemporary, though these are broad distinctions, with different styles within each one, and the dividing lines are not clear-cut. The role of the Church. Like other art forms, music has been shaped by external influences as well as by brilliant individuals. The first of these was the Church. Western classical music originated in a Europe dominated by the Church. In addition to wielding considerable political power, the clergy provided the only source of learning in society. For the educated, music was part of an act of worship, not entertainment. It was sung by monks without instrumental accompaniment. Music is the social act of communication among people, a gesture of friendship, the strongest there is. Malcolm Arnold. The New Art. For hundreds of years, the Church resisted any change to the simple chanting of sacred texts, the rise and fall of which was represented on manuscripts by neumes. Eventually, however, new ideas found their way in. With the invention of a system of notation by Guido d'Arezzo, a monk in 11th century Italy, choristers began to sing simple harmonies to the tunes. They later embellished them with other melodies, creating polyphony, a new sound that, in the 14th century, was hailed as the Ars Nova, the new art. Composers soon introduced other innovations, such as an organ accompaniment. The Church began to lose its control over music, and culture in general, a process helped along by the birth of a new cultural movement, the Renaissance. As the taboo surrounding secular music disappeared, composers expressed themselves more freely, and their music spread through Europe, especially after the invention of a method for printing and therefore distributing music. No longer controlled by the Church, musicians sought employment in the aristocratic courts of Italy, France, Britain, and the Netherlands, where they made a comfortable living providing entertainment. The Church still wielded some power, however, and after the Reformation, a more austere musical style was imposed on the Protestant churches in Northern Europe, and even the Catholic authorities looked to curb the complexity of polyphony. Composers thus developed a simpler yet more expressive harmonic style. Monteverdi's Vespers of 1610 broke new ground for sacred music by incorporating elements of this exciting new style. Musical explosion. Around the same time, in Florence, a group of intellectuals called the Camerata de' Bardi came up with a new form of entertainment, combining music and drama to create opera. This was a success in the aristocratic courts, which continued to act as patrons to composers and performers, but there was also an increasing public demand for opera and music in general, prompting investment in opera houses, concert halls, and public theaters. As the Baroque period progressed, composers such as J.S. Bach and George Friedrich Handel created works of increasing complexity, taking advantage of the orchestras provided by their aristocratic patrons. The music of the High Baroque era was particularly expressive, often ornamented with trills and other embellishments, and sometimes dazzlingly virtuosic. For a while, the concert-going public flocked to hear the latest orchestral showpieces, operas, and choral works, but then the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, dawned, and fashions changed. There was suddenly a demand for more elegant music emphasizing balance and clarity, leading to the classical period from which classical music gets its name. In a short time, classical composers, such as Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, established the musical forms that are the staple of modern concert repertoires, including the four-movement symphony, the solo concerto, and the string quartet. Music also became popular in the home as the swelling middle class acquired leisure time and musical instruments, including the piano, became more affordable. The Romantic period. Despite its enduring influence, the classical period gave way to a new cultural movement almost as soon as it had begun. As Romanticism, with its emphasis on the individual, swept through Europe, expression took precedence over clarity. Composers stretched the classical forms to their limits in the quest for new sounds. They looked to extra-musical sources of inspiration, such as art, literature, landscapes, and human experience. Romanticism was essentially a Germanic movement, yet its emphasis on the individual provoked a wave of nationalist composers who wanted to distance themselves from Austro-German dominance of the musical Ancien regime and champion the music of individual nations. Russian and Czech composers began to integrate elements of folk music and themes into their work, a trend later explored by composers in other parts of Europe. By the end of the 19th century, the excesses of German Romanticism also precipitated a breakdown of the very foundations of Western music, a structure based on the harmonies of the major and minor keys. What followed was a century of composers seeking not just a fresh style but a completely new musical language. Two of the many strands that emerged were particularly influential: 12-note serialism, pioneered by Arnold Schoenberg and refined by Pierre Boulez, and aleatoricism, in which chance played a role in the composition or performance of music. What passion cannot music raise and quell? John Dryden. New influences. These musical experiments coincided with the evolution of jazz and later the explosion of pop and rock music, whose rhythmic beats had instant appeal, causing audiences to turn away from the unfamiliar sounds of new classical music, and even classical music in general. Nonetheless, popular music also influenced and inspired classical composers, producing a cross-fertilization of ideas that brought new life to classical forms, as did the harnessing of modern technology. Composers such as Karlheinz Stockhausen exploited the potential of the electronic studio and the huge advances in recording equipment. Today, some composers, more conscious of public tastes, are writing in a more accessible style than was the case 50 years ago, but composers continue to experiment, producing music incorporating video, theater, and global influences. The elements of music. In order to understand the ideas and innovations described in this book, it is useful to be familiar with the building blocks of Western classical music, many of which were devised by medieval monks, drawing on concepts formulated by the ancient Greeks. Notes are the fundamental material of all music, either sung or played on an instrument. The pitch of an individual note, how high or low the sound is, especially in relation to others, is represented by a letter, sometimes modified by accidentals, that raise or lower the note by a half step. For much of the history of classical music, melodies were composed using the notes of the major and minor scales, or keys, which help to determine the mood of a piece of music. The key also governs the harmony, when two or more notes are played at the same time. Certain combinations of notes, chords, are consonant, or harmonious, and others more dissonant, harsher. Major chords tend to sound brighter, while minor chords are more mournful. A feature of the Baroque, Classical, and Romantic periods was the system of major-minor tonality in which a key note, called the tonic, is the gravitational center around which a composition revolves, moving away from the tonic to create tension and toward the tonic to resolve it. Rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul. Plato. Musical forms. Different styles of music emphasize particular aspects of its structure. Some focus on melody, perhaps with a harmonic accompaniment, as was common during the early Baroque period. Others employ counterpoint, the interweaving of two or more melodies in a complex form of polyphony that is one of the defining characteristics of Western classical music. Also important is the musical form, or shape, of a piece of music. It may comprise recognizably different sections, perhaps in contrasting keys. For example, in a simple ABA form, a musical idea is presented, followed by a second idea, and then the opening idea is repeated. Musical forms range from simple songs, such as the Lieder, made popular by Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann, to the complexity of a multi-movement symphony. For listeners, the most noticeable difference between a Renaissance song and a full-blown 19th-century symphony is the sound of the voice and/or instruments. Throughout history, new musical instruments have been invented and existing ones refined, giving composers and musicians new sounds with which to work. Each of these instruments has its own distinctive timbre, or tone, and different combinations of instruments and voices have evolved over time. These range from a cappella, through solo instruments, like the piano, and small chamber groups, such as the string quartet, to the full concert orchestra of more than 70 players of stringed, woodwind, brass, and percussion instruments, and since the 1950s, electronic technology. The time is past when music was written for a handful of aesthetes. Sergei Prokofiev. This book. How composers put these musical elements together to develop different genres of classical music, and the factors that influence them, is explained in this book. It presents significant milestones in the history of Western classical music, not only the great composers and their works but also some lesser-known figures whose music exemplifies a style or period. They are arranged in chronological order, placing them in a wider historical context to show how they reflect society and culture. Each article focuses on a piece of music that illustrates a particular development in music, discussing its salient features and its significance in relation to other works by the same composer, or in the same style. An in context, sidebar, and a see also section refer to other pieces of music that are relevant to the one under discussion. As not every major composer, let alone all the great pieces of music, could be featured, a directory section at the end of the book details other significant composers and their work. Introduction. What is now known as Western classical music evolved from the music of the medieval church in Europe, which in turn had its roots in Jewish religious music and the music of classical Rome and Greece. Our knowledge of this early music is limited, however, as it was an oral tradition, memorized by musicians and passed down from generation to generation. The little that is known for certain comes from contemporary accounts, which almost exclusively describe sacred music, as the Church effectively had a monopoly on literacy. The role of the Church. The story of classical music begins with sacred Latin texts sung by monks as part of acts of worship. The performance was simple, it was exclusively vocal music, without accompaniment, and consisted of a single line of music, known as monody, which could be sung by one voice or a choir singing in unison. The tunes they sang are called plain chant, and each region had its own collection of chants. At the beginning of the 7th century, however, Pope Gregory attempted to collect, categorize, standardize, and teach these regional variations of plain chant as part of his efforts to unify liturgical practice. In order to guarantee that performance of these plain chants was standardized across the whole of Christendom, a form of music notation was developed. This used symbols, known as neumes, written above the text to give a graphic indication of the shape of the melody. At this point, sometime in the 9th century, the pace of change began to accelerate. A standardized form of church service, the Mass, was established, and specific plain chants were assigned to its various sections. Notation also became more sophisticated, with a horizontal line to clarify the pitch of the notes, showing how high or low they are. Most significant musically was the introduction of organum, a simple form of harmony. Where plain chant had consisted of a single line of music, organum had 2, and later 3 or even 4 lines. One voice would sing the plain chant, and the other a parallel line of music a few notes higher or lower. As the music became more complex over the years, the means of writing it down also evolved, and in the 11th century a system of differently shaped dots written on a staff of 4 or more horizontal lines was established this way, the forerunner of our modern system of music notation. Music spreads. Notation not only helped standardize performance but also enabled musicians to write new music, which they did from the 12th century onward, marking the beginning of classical music as it is known today. Music was no longer anonymous and passed on orally, and this led to the emergence of composers and compositions. This new breed of composer was keen to try out innovatory techniques. The simple harmony of organum, with voices singing in parallel with the melody of the plain chant, was succeeded by a more complex style, polyphony, in which each voice has its own melody. This new technique was pioneered by Léonin and Periton in Paris and rapidly caught on across Europe. At the same time, secular music was flourishing, too, in the form of traveling minstrels who entertained in the aristocratic courts and on the street. Known as troubadours, trouvères, or similar regional variations, they were poets as well as composers and performers and, unlike church musicians, sang their songs with an instrumental accompaniment. It is likely that these entertainers also played purely instrumental music for dancing, but as such secular music was still an oral tradition, none has survived. By the mid-14th century, polyphonic music with interweaving vocal lines had become known as ars nova, the new art, and composers who had mastered the technique were commissioned to write masses for the cathedrals. The new style was not exclusively developed for the Christian. Massachusetts composers also wrote shorter settings of words in the same polyphonic style called motets. Some were settings of sacred texts, but a number of serious composers were also writing polyphonic motets on secular poems. As the medieval period drew to a close, and the Renaissance got underway, the Church's monopoly on music was on the wane. Sacred and secular music were about to flourish side by side. In context. Focus plainsong. Before. Circa 1400 BC, a clay tablet from the ancient city of Ugarit in northern Syria records the hymn of a religious cult, with fragmentary musical notation. c. 200 BC, 100 CE, found on a tombstone in a town near Ephesus, in Turkey, the Song of Psycholos is the earliest complete, notated musical composition. After 1562-1563, the Catholic Church's Council of Trent bans the singing of the medieval embellishments of plainchant known as sequences. 1896, the monks of the Benedictine Abbey de Solesmes published their Liber Usualis, an attempt to restore Gregorian chant, distorted by centuries of use, to a more pristine and standardized text. The early Christian Church began as a Jewish sect, so the evolving liturgy, or forms of service, of the new faith shared many traits with Jewish worship, including the repeated speaking, or chanting, of scripture and prayer. Specifically, Christian aspects focused on particular types of observance, such as the reenactment of the Last Supper and psalm singing, scripture readings, and prayer to mark the new Church's holy days and feasts. Over time, these rites evolved into the divine office or liturgy of the hours, the basis of Roman Catholic worship. A wooden sculpture of Saint Ambrose shows him in his study. The Roman bishop championed the hymn, or sacred song, as a key part of church worship. The singing of rites. As Christianity spread from the Holy Land, so did its rites and ceremonies, celebrated in the languages of the communities where it took root, such as Aramaic in Palestine and Greek in Rome. As a result, different chant styles evolved, including the Mozarabic in Iberia, the Gallican in Roman Gaul, and Ambrosian, after Saint Ambrose, a 4th century bishop of Milan. Of these earliest liturgies, only the Roman and Ambrosian chants have survived in a recognizable form. They became known as plainsong for the simplicity of their unaccompanied melodies, which were sung in a free, speech-like rhythm, reflecting the unmetrical prose of prayers, psalms, and the scriptures. This music, though unstructured, largely followed the ancient Greek modal system of 7-note octaves made up of 5 tones and 2 semitones, and consisted of 2 types of chant, the responsorial and the antiphonal. The former involved more elaborate, solo chants, with a response from the choir. Antiphonal chants, where singing alternated between choir and congregation, consisted of simpler melodies. These forms were shared by Roman and Ambrosian plainsong, but Ambrosian chant was smoother in its note progression and more dramatic than Roman chant. It also made greater use of melisma, in which a string of notes was sung on one syllable, a style still used in Middle Eastern and Asian song. By the middle of the first millennium, thousands of chants existed across the different rites. The sheer variety of unique styles and traditions was addressed by Gregory I, who wished to unify liturgical practice. Gregory consolidated the music of the Roman Rite and is said to have instigated a papal schola cantorum to do justice to the evolving repertoire. This Gregorian chant, Hodie Cantandis, by Saint Tuatilo, a 10th century Irish monk, has neumes on the upper lines and Latin script underneath. Expanded repertoire. Under the rule of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, Roman chants were synthesized with elements of the Gallican style, which was also in common use. This expanded collection formed the basis of Gregorian chant, which remains at the heart of Catholic Church music. Plain psalm was also the foundation for medieval and Renaissance music and its notation, based on the staves and neumes, or notes, of written chants. The Mass. It took until at least the 11th century for the Mass to reach a final form. Its music became known as the Gradual, a book divided into the ordinary and the proper. The ordinary of the Mass has 5 parts. The first, Kyrie eleison, is an ancient text in Greek. The second, Gloria in excelsis Deo, was introduced in the 7th century. The third, the Credo, was adopted in 1014. And the fourth, the Sanctus, rooted in Jewish liturgy, had become part of the Roman Rite before the reforms of Pope Gregory I. The fifth section, Agnus Dei, was added to the Roman Mass in the 7th century, originating from a Syrian rite. See also, Micrologus Magnus Liber Organi Mess de Notre Dame Canticum Canticorum Great Service. The ritual of the Mass was based on the Last Supper, shared by Christ and his disciples, seen here in this detail from a 6th century manuscript. In context. Focus. Early music notation before 500 C. Boethius, a Roman senator and philosopher, writes De Institution Musica, which was still in use as a music primer in the 16th century. 935 C. In France, Odo of Cluny's Enchiridion Musics becomes the first book to name musical pitches with the letters A to G. After 1260 German music theorist Franco of Cologne writes Ars Cantus Mensurabilis, which adds refinements to Guido's notation. 1300 in Paris, Johannes de Garlandia writes De Mensurabili Musica, describing the 6 rhythmic modes. Modern Western musical notation has its origins in Europe's monasteries at the end of the first millennium. The earliest musical symbols, called neumes, were written aids for chants that used simple pen strokes to remind the monks if the music moved up or down, or remained on the same tone. Diastematic or heightened neumes brought more clarity to notated chant by formalizing the note shapes and imagining a single horizontal line across the page. This gave a horizon against which the singer could work out the pitch. Nonetheless, heightened neumes were open to misinterpretation and greater precision was needed. Invention of the staff. The solution, credited to Guido d'Arezzo, an Italian monk and music theorist, was to draw 4 lines across the page, allowing the singer to precisely gauge the melody's movement. Guidonian notation sometimes has one of the lines in yellow ink to show the note C, and one in red to show F, so pitch was now not only fixed from note to note, but the singer knew at a glance on which note to start. Guido's treatise Micrologus describes the singing aid for which he is best known, the Guidonian hand. If a modern singer has to describe a particular note, they might picture the continuous row of notes, using 7 letters from A to G, repeated over the 7 octaves of a piano. To specify a particular C, the singer might say middle C. However, if that is not the one they had in mind, they might have to say clumsily C, the octave above middle C. Guido, requiring only 2.5 octaves to cover the vocal range of the chants, used the same 7-note names we use today for his singing aid. The novice monk would point to the tip of his left-hand thumb and sing a low G. Sliding his finger to his thumb's middle joint, his voice ascended to A, and so on up the scale, spiraling his finger around the joints and tips of his fingers to indicate all 20 notes. The Guidonian hand was a system invented to teach monks the easiest way to reference the 20 notes of medieval liturgical music. I have determined to notate this antiphonor, so that any intelligent and diligent person can learn a chant. Guido d'Arezzo. Psalmization syllables. Guido backed up these 7-letter names with 6 psalmization syllables: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, a system of talking about melodies in an abstract way. This was the precursor to today's more familiar sol fa, but Guido's syllables differ in that his psalmization did not use the note ti, so it has only 6 notes, a hexachord. As the range went beyond the 6 notes, the hexachord had to be repeated in overlapping patterns over the extent of the 20 notes of Guido's hand. Each note then ended up with both a base letter name and a secondary coordinate, derived from the note's unique position on the hand, to designate the octave. Modern middle C translates to C sol faut on the Guidonian hand, and the lowest G, using the Greek letter name, was gamma ut, hence the expression still in use today, running the gamut. The monk could now easily specify any of the 20 notes in conversation, in writing, or by simply pointing to his hand. Italian monk and music theorist Guido d'Arezzo wears a laurel wreath in a portrait painted by Antonio Maria Crespi in the early 16th century, some 600 years after Guido's death. The modes. Western music inherited a theoretical foundation based on early church musical practices in Greece, Syria, and Byzantium. Sometime in the 10th century, the principle of musical modes developed, by which the various melodies of plainchant were categorized. Modes helped monks remember the many liturgical works. Modes can be played by using only the white notes on a piano. If you were to play 6 complete 7-note scales, starting on each of the following notes, that would give an idea of how each basic corresponding church mode would sound. C. Ionian mode. Corresponding with the major scale, D, E, F, G, A. Music was organized according to this modal theory until, by the time of 18th century Baroque composers, such as Bach and Handel, the major and minor principle of tonal harmony essentially reduced the number of scales to just 2. From then on, music was considered to be in a particular key and not in any given mode. See also, Plainchant Ordo Virtutum Ligur de Robin et de Marian Great Service Monteverdi's Vespers Street Matthew Passion. In context. Focus. Early female composers before c. 920. The surviving 2 stanzas of Joran's Skaldmar Sendibit represent the longest skaldic verse by a woman. 1150. In Paris, Abbess Heloise possibly composes the Easter music drama Ortolanus, and the Easter sequence Epithalamica, attributed to theologian Peter Abelard. After 1180. Beatrice Comtesse de Dia writes a collection of 5 troubadour songs. The song A Chant par Emer de Sochu no Varia survives with notation. 1210. Juliana of Liege may have written music for the feast of Corpus Christi, which is said to have come to her in a vision. One of the most original voices in sacred music of the early Middle Ages was that of the female cleric Hildegard of Bingen in Germany. Her musical output is also one of the largest of any single identifiable medieval composer. Her collection entitled Symphonia Armoni Celestium Revelationum, for example, includes more than 70 plainchant compositions. Hildegard grew up under the tutelage of a young visionary called Jutta of Sponheim. With support from Jutta and a monk named Volmar at the Abbey of Disibodenberg, Hildegard learned the psalms and practiced the chant repertory of the church year, studied the playing of the psaltery, and learned to write Latin. Like Jutta, Hildegard professed to be divinely inspired, claiming to have never learned neumes or any other part of music. While the truth of this assertion is unknown, it may have been an attempt to disassociate herself and Jutta from an education that ordinarily would not have been available to women. For women in the 12th century, to profess knowledge of the trivium or quadrivium or to provide interpretation of the Bible might be considered a direct threat to male authority. Hildegard receives a divine vision in an image from a 13th century manuscript. She is accompanied by Volmar of Disibodenberg and her confidant Richardis von Stade. Magnum opus. The earliest extant morality play, and one of the first musical dramas to be recorded, Hildegard's most well-known work, Ordo Virtutum, contains more than 80 melodies that form a musical drama most likely intended to be performed by the nuns of Hildegard's order. The play calls for a cast of more than 20 singing roles and concerns the struggle for a soul between 17 virtues and their adversary, Diabolus. Diabolus, perhaps originally spoken by Hildegard's friend and scribe Volmar, lacks all harmony and articulates in spoken interjections. The accompanying melodies in the manuscript indicate when the virtues sing as a chorus and gives more florid music to the solo voices. As the virtues step forward to introduce themselves, the music becomes more expressive and animated, the sweeping vocal lines of Humilitas, Fide, and Spes inspiring the sister virtues to respond with ardor. However, the original notation is little more than the barest of bones. Recordings with fiddles, flute, and harmonized accompaniments represent the modern interpretation of this sketch. Heaven was opened and a fiery light of exceeding brilliance came and permeated my whole brain. And immediately I knew the meaning of the exposition of the scriptures. Hildegard of Bingen. Writings and Divinity. Hildegard's letters reveal her status as seer and mystic, which allowed her not just the freedom to offer stern advice but opportunities for musical expression. She often emphasized the transcendent origin of her works. Music connected her to a lost Eden, before Adam and Eve precipitated the fall of humankind by eating the forbidden fruit. She envisaged her texts being at the service of the music, so that those who hear might be taught about inward things. Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098 as the youngest child in a large family of lesser nobility, Hildegard spent her early childhood in Bermersheim, south of Mainz, in Germany. She suffered from ill health, and even before the age of 5 began to see visions, drawing the family's attention to her spiritual acuity by predicting the color of an unborn calf. At about the age of 8, she was placed in the care of Jutta of Sponheim, a visionary who lived as a recluse in a hermitage near the abbey at Dissebodenberg. The women's hermitage was later opened to monastic aspirants, and at the age of 14 Hildegard devoted her life to God as a Benedictine nun. On the death of Jutta in 1136, and at the age of 38, Hildegard was elected to lead the religious community. She performed this role until her death in 1179 but also found time to write 3 volumes of visionary theology, scientific works, and religious verse. Other key work. See point 1150s Symphonia Armoni Celestium Revelationum. See also, Le Jeu de Robin et de Marion Messe de Notre Dame Missile Home Arm the Wrecker's Blue Cathedral. In context. Focus. The rise of vocal harmony before. See point 1000 more than 160 organa, probably written by Wulfstan, the cantor of Winchester Cathedral, are collected in the Winchester Trope. See point 1140 the Codex Calixtinus mentions a certain Magister Albertus Parisiensis as composer of the first notated work for 3 voices. After. See point 1200 Periton improves and expands on Leonin's work in the Magnus Liber Organi. The development of polyphony in the mid-12th century is closely linked to Notre Dame in Paris, the lavish new cathedral built by Maurice de Sully when he became Bishop of Paris in 1160. Around this time, a French composer called Léonin was creating fresh embellishments for 2 voices, in order to enhance the traditional plainchant. Under the patronage of the cathedral, Léonin and a number of other innovative composers formed what later became known as the Notre Dame School. Composing organa. There are no records of Léonin until nearly a century after he was active, when an Englishman studying in Paris wrote about Master Leoninus. He described Léonin as the Optimus Organista and the author of the Magnus Liber Organi, an anthology of music used by the cathedral to solemnify the liturgy. Anonymous 4 writes that Léonin's great book was used until the time of Periton, who was known as the best composer of discants, an organum with countermelodies on top of the plain song. Periton shortened and improved Léonin's organa, wrote better clausulae, and also composed organa for 3 and 4 voices. According to Anonymous 4, Periton's music was still in use at Notre Dame in his time. The nave of Notre Dame de Paris was completed shortly after the death of Maurice de Sully in 1196. Léonin and Periton created their music in or close to the new cathedral. Early harmony. Before the time of Léonin, vocal harmonies were far simpler. Theorists took a certain interest in the practice of singing in parts from the latter half of the 9th century, but the stages in the development of harmony singing are unclear. The Papal Schola Cantorum of the 7th century maintained a total of 7 singers, including 3 scoli, as well as an archiparaphonista and 3 paraphonisti, a Greek term meaning one who sings alongside the chant. Some musicologists believe this may suggest the presence of singers who specialized in a harmonizing role. The simplest harmonizing technique was for a singer to hold the finalise of the mode of the piece as a sustained note underneath the chant. This would be sung to an open vowel sound, perhaps occasionally shifting the single note to an adjacent pitch, to make a more pleasant relationship with the chant before moving back to the finalise. Traditions involving a fixed note accompaniment are still heard today, in Sufi Muslim Qawwali music from India and Pakistan, and in bagpipe music. Cistercian monks at Zwettl Abbey, Austria, practice choral singing in this miniature accompanying notation for the graduals Cistercienses. A gradual is a liturgical chant or hymn. A sinful sound. The move toward polyphony was not universally welcomed. Some within the Church objected to the new methods, notably the English Cardinal Robert of Corcun, who criticized the writers of organum on the grounds that this new music was effeminate. In his Summa, he wrote that, "If a wanton prelate gives benefices to such wanton singers in order that this kind of minstrelish and wanton music may be heard in his church, I believe that he becomes contaminated with the disease of simony." Attitudes such as Corcun's, which associated the intertwined male voices of polyphony with sodomy, sought to discredit the new musical style by associating it with sin. 2 handbooks. The first works that attempted to explain vocal harmony were Musica and Kyriadis, c. 900, and its companion text Scholia and Kyriadis. The simplest harmonizing method illustrated by the writer of the handbooks was singing in octaves. This technique was known as magadizing in ancient Greece and occurs naturally when men and boys sing in unison. The method of utilizing a basic harmony, parallel to the original chant, was called simple organum by the writer of the Enchiriadis. Scholia and Kyriadis also suggests a hybrid method, whereby the vox originalis either holds a pitch or moves in parallel harmony with the vox principalis before returning to a unison with the chant at the ends of phrases. Although simple organum involves more than one voice, this singing in octaves is not normally described by modern writers as polyphony, because the 2 parts are not independent. Creating harmony by simply following the melody at a different octave makes the harmonizing part a slave to the chant's shape and movement. The effect is to enrich the sound of the chant, but the technique of finding this added harmony has little finesse. Musicologists prefer to describe this technique as a version of heterophony. Periton's Alleluia Nativitas was written for 3 voices. As seen here, the number of lines in a staff was not fixed at this time. They merely gave a rough idea of the height of the notes. Masters of organum set minstrelish and effeminate things before young and ignorant persons. Robert of Corcun, English Cardinal. Scattered examples. A short piece of organum for 2 voices moving independently came to light in 2014 on the back leaf of a manuscript in the British Library that can be dated to c. 900. It appears to demonstrate that some singers in northwest Germany were quite adept at this hybrid style of organum by the end of the 9th century. Although it is a single isolated example, the piece is agreed to be the oldest existing notated piece of polyphonic music for performance. The Winchester Troper, a manuscript copied into 2 books at Winchester Cathedral from French sources a few decades after Saint Boniface Martyr, gives a snapshot of monastic musical life in England prior to the Norman conquest. Although the second volume contains 174 organa, the notation assumes that the singer already has some knowledge of the repertoire. The unstaffed neumes do not give a precise indication of pitch, either of the original chant melody or in the harmonizing vox originalis, making accurate transcription of these pieces difficult. A century after the Winchester Troper, the school of Saint Martial of Limoges explored polyphony in 90 pieces in 4 French manuscripts, and the Codex Calixtinus from Santiago de Compostela, in northwest Spain. The notation of this Aquitanian polyphony was less ambiguous in pitch than the Troper and suggests that most of the repertoire was sung to a rhythm. The pieces are mostly for 2 singers in a more melismatic style, in which the upper voice sometimes has many notes, sung over a less active lower voice. The Codex Calixtinus contains what may be the first composition notated for 3 voices, the Congaudient Catholici. The Notre Dame School. As the Cathedral of Notre Dame rose up on the Isle de la Cite in Paris, the discant style emerged, which allowed the upper voice of organ more freedom. The roles of the 2 singers diverged into that of the florid soloist and an accompanying voice holding long notes. This distinction was reflected in the new titles of tenor and diplôme. At this time, Léonin introduced a greater degree of rhythmic organization to his compositions, regulating the flow of the meter in an early form of motorhythm. In its mature iteration, motorhythm sets the line in motion according to one of 6 metrical patterns. These are indicated by 2 note shapes, longa and brevis, the duration of the note depending on context. Léonin's development of organum in the discant style owed much to this innovation. Periton, Léonin's successor in the Parisian style of discant, went one better, composing organum triplum, and even organum quadruplum, for 3 and 4 voices respectively. Proclaiming their magnificence, the Bishop of Paris decreed in 1198 that Periton's 4-voice works Viderunt Omnes and Sederunt Principes should be performed on Christmas Day, St. Stephen's Day, and again on New Year's Day. Periton, called Perotin Magister by Anonymous IV, is believed to have lived from c. 1160–1230. He is pictured here with church bells at Notre Dame de Paris. Notated his books very faithfully according to the use and custom of his master, and even better. Anonymous 4. See also, Plainchant Micrologus Mess de Notre Dame Canticum Canticorum Monteverdi's Vespers ein Festberg ist unser In context. Focus. Secular medieval music before. Circa 1160 Festum Stultorum appears in Paris and Beauvais as an opportunity around Christmas for clerics to indulge in a parody of the liturgy. Circa 1230 Ludus Danielis is written in Beauvais as a liturgical drama in Latin. After late 14th century the annual cycle of mystery plays begins in York and Wakefield, England. Diverse musical traditions are known to have flourished in European towns and villages in the Middle Ages, as they did in the courts of noble families, yet almost none of this popular music survives in notation. While the Church used scribes to regulate and record its own repertoire for posterity, much secular music was passed on orally. However, the lack of written sources among common people is not just the consequence of poor literacy. For many dance musicians and the singers of epics, a written text would not have reflected the skillful, improvisatory nature of their profession, honed by generations of hereditary entertainers. Furthermore, by recording their works in a manuscript, they risked handing their cherished repertoire to rivals. The sources of European secular music tended to be found where popular styles aroused the interest of the church or nobility. The crusading knights of southern France found the highly developed styles of instrumental and vocal music they encountered on crusades in the Holy Land particularly appealing, this being a period of great cultural exchange as well as of conflict and hostility. Le Jeu de Robin et de Marion was performed in St. Petersburg, Russia, in 1907. Its set design was recorded in watercolor by Mstislav Dobuzinski. Languages and influences. Medieval secular music features distinct poetic identities linked to regional languages. 2 medieval French languages emerged from Latin, Langue d'Oc or Occitan in southern France and northern Spain, and Langue d'Oil, north of the Loire. Each of these languages had its own bardic tradition. The south had the music of the troubadour and female troubadours, while the north used the word trouvère, both of which may have come from the early French word troubar, meaning to find or invent. An alternative root may be the Arabic word tarab, meaning source of joy. One of the earliest troubadours, William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, was said to have sung, in verse with pleasant tunes, about his experience of leading the so-called Crusade of the Faint-Hearted into Anatolia in 1101. His songs are clearly influenced by Arabic poetic conventions, in particular the popular song forms of Muwasha and Zajal. A play with music. The 13th century musician Adam de la Halle has been described as a trouvère. De la Halle probably wrote Le Jeu de Robin et de Marion for his fellow Frenchmen as part of a Christmas celebration in Naples in 1284. The French noblemen had taken refuge there after the island of Sicily had overthrown the rule of Charles I of Anjou. In a bloody Easter coup, the Jeu tells the story of a country maid who is wooed by a lustful knight yet remains true to her lover Robin. The titular characters performed the bulk of the music, in monophonic songs that de la Halle created by setting his own lyrics to tunes in a popular style. Some have called it the first comic opera, although modern audiences might more readily identify the piece as pantomime. Halle's comedy knew no limits. He poked fun at the church and its corrupt clerics, at the people of Arras, where he lived and worked, and even his own family and life. Adam de la Halle. French musician Adam de la Halle was born in the cloth-working city of Arras in 1222, and grew up learning about music as part of his theological education at the Abbey of Vaucelles, founded only a century before. De la Halle's father expected him to enter the church, but he chose a different path. After a short-lived marriage, he enrolled at the University of Paris, where, among other things, he learned the polyphonic techniques that he would later apply to popular musical genres. De la Halle initially used his verse to speak out against the corrupt administration of Arras but later entered into noble service. It was in the service of Charles of Anjou, who became King of Naples, that he wrote Le Jeu de Robin et de Marion. Halle died a few years later, sometime between 1285 and 1288. Other key works. Date unknown Mout me fou grief Robin main portar. Date unknown A joints mains vous proy. Chivalric tales. The songs of both troubadours and trouvères have their roots in the medieval culture of Finnemore, the chivalric code of etiquette between a knight and an idealized lady, based on the principles of allegiance and fealty that defined a noble life. De la Halle's Robin and Marion played to this idea, as a depiction of a knight trying to woo his love, but was also influenced by the French pastoral storytelling tradition. Troubadour verse has survived well. There are more than 2,000 extant poems composed by more than 450 known poets. However, transmission of the musical accompaniment for these songs is patchy, with barely 10% of the poems having their associated melodies relayed in notation. Trouvère activity in northern France began with the 13th century poet Chrétien de Troyes, about 70 years after the first troubadour in the south. The number of surviving trouvère songs is similar to that of the southern corpus, but more than 60% of trouvère songs have music, albeit without precise information concerning rhythm. Henry of Meissen performs at court in the Codex Manesse. The musician was called Frauenlob for his chivalric songs. Southern Europe. While troubadours and trouvères were a distinct group of courtly poets writing in specific poetic genres, lesser entertainers were manifold, and their activities were varied. In Southern Europe, a musician might go by the title of joglar or joglarisa, while their northern counterparts were called jongler. The skill sets of these musicians encompassed feats of dexterity, fluency in any instrument required for dancing, singing songs of love and heroes, or simply playing the fool. Yet, in spite of the joy they brought, itinerant entertainers were not only on the lowest rung of the social order but were also outside of the protection of the law. One example of jogglar's song is the work of Martin Kodak's, written in the style of cantiga de amigo, a genre that told stories from a woman's point of view. Kodak's, for example, evoked the emotions of a woman left on the shore in Vigo, waiting for her beloved to come home from sea. When I see the lark set flight for joy toward the sun, it's a marvel that my heart does not melt with longing at the sight. Bernard de Ventadorn. Tavern players. Another type of medieval musician at this time, the Goliards, had a lot in common with traveling musicians, but were, in fact, unemployed clerics known for playing bawdy songs in taverns that satirized society at all levels. The Carmina Burana manuscript is the main surviving source of Goliard's song. The title Menestro meanwhile refers to one who is a little minister, in service perhaps at court, or to a city. Armed with finely honed musical skills and a claim to a patron's protection, a minstrel might hope to escape some of the opprobrium that was often leveled at a jongleur. By the 14th century, however, the term menestrel was increasingly used in France as a term to describe all urban musicians, many of whom played in taverns or on the streets. Songs in German. The genre of courtly love extended all the way from Latin Europe to the German-speaking peoples, where the Minzingers sang songs about chivalric romances. Like his French counterpart, the Minzinger was normally welcome in noble houses as a social equal, and examples of early milliliters suggest that Travers songs were known in Germany. By 1200, the style asserted a stronger identity characterized by the work of Walther von Vogelweide, but, compared to the works from Spanish and French traditions, few milliliters survive with contemporary melodies. Medieval instruments. Many of the instruments associated with European medieval music have their roots in North Africa, Central Asia, and the Balkans. These included the lute, the rebec, and the shawm, the precursor of the oboe. The European tabor is akin to the Indian tabla, while nakars were related to the Asian nakara. The English word fanfare, probably derived from Arabic anfar, meaning trumpets. Early poets often accompanied themselves on the viol, a bowed string instrument supported on the collarbone. A viol could have anywhere from 3 to 6 strings passing over a flat bridge, or string support. This favored a harmonic style of playing with many strings sounding at once, unlike the arched bridge of the modern violin, which allows individual strings to be sounded, thus favoring melody. Europe's secular music makers. Musicians fitted into distinct categories that were defined by social status and their typical audience. See also, Misselholm Armwater Musique de table the magic flute die Sean Mullerin. In context. Focus. Polyphony and the notation revolution before. Circa 1320, the Tournai Mass is the first known Mass that uses polyphony. Many sounds. Circa 1350, the Toulouse Mass assembles polyphonic mass movements arranged from existing motets. After 1415-1421, the Old Hall manuscript contains several polyphonic settings of the Kyrie to suit the English fashion for elaboration of that section of the Mass. 1440's Missa Caput is an early Mass by an English composer using a cantus firmus around which other melodies are based. It includes a bass voice below that of the tenor, one of the first compositions with a bass part. The 14th century was one of the most turbulent periods of medieval history. The Little Ice Age, which began around 1300, resulted in crop failures and famines, including the Great Famine of 1312-1317, and the Black Death killed up to 60% of Europe's population. Such extreme social, economic, and environmental upheaval shook religious certainties. Scholars, such as the French scientist cleric Nicole Orsma, began to envision a more complex universe than the faith-based view of the natural world. Music, already embracing polyphony, was also influenced by this way of thinking and exploded into new metrical complexity when Orsma's fellow Frenchman, the mathematician-composer Philippe de Vitry, devised a precise method to notate rhythm. A new order of rhythm. The new style became known as Ars Nova after de Vitry's treatise Ars Nova not Andi, published in 1322. Vitry composed vocal pieces to demonstrate the novel notation in the form of motets. Each of Vitry's motets, only 12 of which survive, displayed different aspects of a technique known today as isorhythm, which aimed to give structure to extended compositions. Vitry took a series of notes in the tenor voice and applied a rhythmic pattern to it. The talia was usually shorter than the color, so it might require several cycles of the talia to equal one repetition of the color. The Church was not enamored of Ars Nova, and Pope John XXI condemned it in a decree of 1323. The clergy were alarmed by the style's role in the secularization of the once purely sacred motet, which was now appropriated as a way to comment on events of the day. The satirical poem Le Roman de Fauvel, for example, contains 130 musical works, including 5 motets by de Vitry. Despite the religious opposition, the precision of the new notation opened the door to experiments in rhythm and meter. These can be heard in the intricate and shifting rhythms of the songs of the Italians Matteo da Perugia and Philippus de Caserta and the French composer Baud Cordier, in a style that is now known as Ars Subtilior. Ars Nova had become established and went on to form the basis for the development of rhythmic notation in Western music. Musicians illuminate a 1316 manuscript of Le Roman de Fauvel, a French poem by Gervais du Bus, which is interspersed with some of the first Ars Nova music. Certain disciples of the new art are preoccupied with their measured dividing up of beats. We forbid these methods. Pope John XXI. Changing the Mass. De Vitry's ideas found perhaps their greatest flowering in the music of Guillaume de Machaut, a 14th-century composer and poet. Machaut used the same isorhythmic techniques in his own motets and in the Kyrie, Sanctus, Agnus Dei, and Ite Missa Est movements of his Messe de Notre Dame, the first known setting of polyphonic music for a complete Mass cycle by a single composer. As well as using isorhythm to unify elements of the Mass, Machaut also employed a plainsong cantus firmus as a linking melody for each movement, from which other melodies develop, and added a contratenor to raise the number of voices from 3 to a richer and more expansive 4. Machaut secured his artistic heritage by carefully managing his own output, collecting his works in manuscripts that he compiled during his lifetime. Besides his importance as a composer, Machaut was one of the greatest French poets of the medieval period, producing extensive poetic narratives in the form of lays and dits. He also developed shorter poetic genres with repeated phrases, or refrains, such as the ballade, rondo, and virelai, which became popular vehicles of expression for poets and composers of subsequent generations. Guillaume de Machaut. Born in the Champagne region of France around 1300, Machaut spent much of his life in and around the nearby city of Reims. After taking holy orders, in 1323 he joined the household of John of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia, traveling with him around Eastern Europe and Italy as his chaplain and secretary. Through King John, Machaut acquired lucrative benefices as canon of the cathedrals at Verdun in 1330, Arras in 1332, and in Reims in 1337. After King John's death at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, Machaut found further patronage from Bonne of Luxembourg, the second daughter of King John the Blind, and Charles II, King of Navarre in Spain. The composer's final years were spent in Reims, overseeing the compilation of his works. He died in 1377 and was buried in Reims Cathedral. Other key works. c. 1330s Daus Dame Jolie. c. 1340s Rose Liz Printemps Vergercy, 1340s Voirdet. See also, Magnus Liber Organi Missa L'Homme Armi Missa Pange Lingua Canticum Canticorum Monteverdi's Vespers. Introduction. The cultural movement known as the Renaissance emerged in Italy as early as the 14th century. However, a distinctively Renaissance style of music did not manifest itself until some years later. It first flourished in the Netherlands, at the court of Philip the Good of Burgundy. The composers there, although Franco-Flemish by birth, were cosmopolitan by nature. The leading light of the Franco-Flemish school, Guillaume Dufay, inspired by the Ars Nova polyphony that he had heard while in Italy, found a way to break with the medieval style and began to redefine Renaissance music. One of Dufay's innovations was his use of the cantus firmus, the technique of composing a polyphonic piece around a plainchant melody. Echoing the Renaissance trend toward increasing secularization, he started to use secular melodies instead of plainchant as a basis for his masses, which were in a richly expressive polyphonic style. He and other composers at the Burgundian court, including Gilles Binchois, Johannes Ockeghem, and one of the finest composers of the early Renaissance, Josquin des Prés, did not restrict themselves to sacred music and also wrote secular motets and chansons. New challenge. The Franco-Flemish school of polyphony dominated the music of the early Renaissance, but in the 16th century, things changed dramatically. The power that the Catholic Church had wielded in medieval times was being challenged, and in 1517 Martin Luther triggered the Reformation. Much of Northern Europe converted to the Protestant Church, which had a very different attitude to music for their services, preferring simple hymns and melodies for the congregation to sing rather than polyphonic masses sung only by the choir. Such music became the foundation of a distinctly Germanic musical tradition. The Reformation had, however, provoked a reaction in the Catholic world, the Counter-Reformation, in which the Church defended some of its practices while examining and reforming others. One of the things that came under scrutiny was the music for church services. Many in the Catholic Church were uncomfortable with the complex polyphony that had become fashionable, as so many voices singing different lines of melody made the words unintelligible. Composers were told to moderate their style, precipitating the adoption of a relatively simple polyphony that avoided the sometimes dissonant harmonies that occur in polyphonic music and emphasized the clarity of the words. This clearer and sweeter-sounding style characterized what came to be regarded as the musical High Renaissance. Among the first composers to adopt the style was Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, who wrote numerous motets and masses for churches in Rome. Composers from across Europe gravitated to Italy to absorb the new sound, before taking it back to their native lands. In England, it was adopted by composers such as Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. Instrumental music. It was not just church music that was changing. By the end of the 14th century, traveling minstrels had all but disappeared thanks to the ravages of the Black Death. They gravitated instead to the aristocratic courts, where they provided entertainment, singing chansons and playing instrumental music for dancing and for civic ceremonies, such as the installation of a new doge in Venice. In a more secularized society, instrumental music became popular not only in the courts but also among an increasingly educated middle class, creating a demand for music to play at home, either in consorts of instruments, such as viols or recorders, or for solo keyboard instruments, such as the harpsichord. Thanks to the development of a mechanical technique for printing, sheet music was readily available, and the new style spread through Europe. Madrigals, for small groups of singers, became a popular form of home entertainment, especially in Italy and England. However, composers and the public were experimenting with another form by the end of the 16th century, and a dramatic new style was heralded by the works of Giovanni Gabrieli in Venice. The last great works to be composed in the Renaissance style were Tomás Luis de Victoria's Officium Defunctorum and John Dowland's Lacrimae, fitting ends to an era. In context. Focused new harmonies. Before 1430 Englishman Lionel Power composes Alma Redemptoris Mater, possibly the first mass to use an identified cantus firmus, a set song, as the basis for its melodic framework. 1430 Rex Secularum is written as a cantus firmus mass in the English style, either by John Dunstable or Lionel Power. After 1570 Italian Giovanni Palestrina publishes a five-voice setting of the Mass on the home arm melody. 1999 Welsh composer Carl Jenkins incorporates the home arm folk song into the first and final movements of his Mass The Armed Man. From Franco-Flemish composer Guillaume Dufay onward, the harmonic language of music begins to sound more familiar to modern listeners. Earlier composers had followed the harmonic ideals worked out by the ancient Greek philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras, based on the perfect consonance of octaves and fourth and fifth intervals. Dufay's innovation was to use chords featuring the third interval in the scale as a harmony note. Historically, the harmony of third intervals had been seen as somewhat dissonant, to be used sparingly. Secular sounds in church. Dufay's masses made much use of the cantus firmus technique, which built a piece around an already existing melody, such as a well-known sacred composition or a plainchant. In L'Homme Arme, Dufay chose a popular French folk song with a distinctive melody that lent itself well to a polyphonic layering of voices. Following the lead of English musicians, who had already embraced the use of third intervals, Dufay allows the music to dwell on the interval's sweet, less hollow sound. This extended the harmonic vocabulary and created room for more voices. Master of melody Guillaume Dufay stands beside a portable organ in an illumination from the 15th century poetic work, Le Champion des Dames. See also, Micrologus Magnus Liber Organi Missapange Lingua Canticum Canticorum Street Matthew Passion. In context. Focus. Dissemination of music before. See point 1415, 1420. The largest collection of 14th century Italian music, the Squarcia Luppi Codex Illuminated Manuscript, is compiled in Florence. 1457. The Codex Salmorum, produced in the German city of Mainz, is the first printed book to contain music, although the notation is handwritten. After. See point 1520. English printer John Rastell produces the first music where the staves, notes, and text are printed in a single impression. 1710. The Statute of Anne, enacted in Britain, gives authors copyright over their printed work for the first time, a right finally extended to music composition in 1777. Josquin des Près, born in France around 1450, was an early beneficiary of the printing press. Until the invention of the technology in the mid-15th century, music was copied out by hand, by professional copyists. According to the 16th century Swiss music theorist Heinrich Galerian des Près, published his works after much deliberation and with manifold corrections. This care and attention made his compositions a favorite in the emerging music publishing market. Des Près' contemporary, the Italian printer Ottaviano Petrucci, perfected a method for printing music in 3 passes: the staves, followed by notes, and then the words. Petrucci's first publication, Ode Hecaton, a selection of nearly 100 secular pieces, mostly by Franco-Flemish composers, including Des Près, Alexandre Agricola, Antoine Busnois, and Jacob Albrecht, appeared in 1501. To meet the challenge of a first collection of polyphonic music. For the Mass with underlaid text, Petrucci chose to devote his Miss to works solely by Des Près. Now that Josquin is dead, he is putting out more works than when he was alive. George Forster. German composer. A Late Mass. Missa Pange Lingua was one of Des Près' final compositions, taking its central melody from a hymn for the feast of Corpus Christi written by the 13th century Italian friar and theologian Thomas Aquinas. The work was not ready in time for Petrucci's final book of Masses in 1514, but it survived in manuscript form and was finally published in 1532. See also, Messe de Notre Dame Missa L'Homme Arme Canticum Canticorum Street Matthew Passion. In context. Focus. Large-scale choral music before. Circa 1500 French composer Antoine Brummel writes a Mass in 12 parts, Missa et Ecce Terrae Motus, known as the Earthquake Massachusetts. 1568 Alessandro Strigio's motet Ecce Beatum Lissum for 40 voices with instruments is performed in Munich. After 1682 Heinrich Bieber composes his Missa Salisburgensis in 53 parts arranged in 6 choirs of singers, strings, recorders, cornets, and sackbuts, with 2 ensembles of trumpets and timpani, and at least 2 organs, probably the largest work in the colossal Baroque style, the name given to large-scale, polychoral works. The composition of the great 40-voice motet Spem in Aelium by Thomas Tallis marked a pinnacle of early English Renaissance choral music and was an inspired response to a continental challenge. In 1567, the composer Alessandro Striggio had arrived in England on a diplomatic mission from the Medici court in Florence, bringing with him the parts for his recent compositions for 40 or more independent voices. These were musical manifestations of influence and power, and some wondered what the result might be if an English composer were to attempt such a composition. They turned to Tallis, who had been the foremost court composer under 4 monarchs, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Tallis's Roman Catholic patron, Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, commissioned the work. A chapel choir sings from sheet music displayed on a lectern in the frontispiece of Practica Musicae by the Italian music theorist Franchini di Gaffurio, published in 1512. A long choral tradition. The English had long excelled at choral music. In the 15th century, John Dunstable established the Continence Angloise, a distinctive, richly harmonic polyphonic style. Flemish music theorist Johannes Tinctoris described Dunstable as the fountain and source of musical innovation. A generation before Tallis, Robert Fairfax was the leading English composer and a favorite of Henry VIII. He was the organist and master of the choristers at St. Albans Abbey from 1498 to 1502 and composed the complex 5-voice Mass O Quam Glorifica for his doctorate in 1504. Masters of Sacred Music. In the early 16th century, John Taverner emerged as a significant composer of English sacred music after his appointment in 1526 as master of the choristers at Thomas Wolsey's newly founded Cardinal College, Oxford. There he composed 3 6-voice masses, Corona Spinia, Gloria Tibi Trinitas, and O Michael. The tenor part from the In Nomine Domini section of the Benedictus of his Gloria Tibi Trinitas became widely used by other composers as the basis of vocal and instrumental arrangements. This was the origin of the English fantasia genre known as In Nomine, which was popular until the late 17th century. Taverner moved back home to Lincolnshire after Wolsey's downfall and produced little more music. John Shepherd was perhaps more adept at tailoring his output to the tastes of Roman Catholic and Protestant monarchs. He was the choirmaster at Magdalen College, Oxford, for 3 years, and then, from 1552, a gentleman of the Chapel Royal under Edward VI and Mary I. He died on the eve of Elizabeth's succession in 1558. Much of Shepherd's Latin-texted church music survives. His Responsori Media Vita for 6 voices is a Lenten work of monumental status. The slow statement of the Nunc Dimittis chant running through the work adds to its impact. The Duke, hearing of the song, took his chain of gold from off his neck and put it about Tallis' neck and gave it him. Thomas Waitridge. Letter. An extraordinary response. Thomas Tallis was a member of the Chapel Royal when Striggio visited and unfurled his multipart scores. The Italian's works were in the polychoral style, with voices grouped into self-contained choirs that came together in a grand sound at crucial points in the score. Tallis's response in his motet Spem in Aelium was quite different. It dipped back into the soaring sound of Taverner's and Shepherd's music to create an unmistakably English piece. The 40 voices of Spem in Aelium seldom gather in the same groupings, but each follow their own paths. One voice may maintain a steady pace on the beat but will have a counterpart that achieves something similar in syncopation, adding a scintillation to the steady voice. Like a gradual murmuration of birds, the voices gather, separate, and finally assemble to exhilarating effect. Thomas Tallis. Little is known of Tallis's early life, but by 1532 he was the organist of Dover Priory, on England's south coast. After the priory's dissolution 3 years later, he worked at the Church of St. Mary at Hill in London, Waltham Abbey, and Canterbury Cathedral, before becoming a member of the choir of Henry VIII's Chapel Royal, where he later became the organist. Queen Elizabeth granted Tallis and William Byrd a patent to print music in 1572, and in 1575 they jointly published Canciones Sacrae, a collection of Latin motets. Tallis was also one of the first to set English words to psalms, canticles, and anthems. Centuries later, his setting of Psalm 2 was used by Vaughan Williams for his Fantasia on a theme of Thomas Tallis. Tallis died peacefully at home in 1585. It is thought he was around 80 years of age. Other key works: 1560, 1569 The Lamentations of Jeremiah. 1567 9 Psalm settings for Archbishop Parker's Psalter. See also, Messe de Notre Dame Missa Lhom ar Missa Pange Lingua Canticum Canticorum Great Service Street Matthew Passion. In context. Focus. Simplification of polyphony before. Circa 1540 in the motet Inviolata, Integra et Casta es Maria, the Italian composer Costanzo Festa uses canonic Flemish style to great effect. Festa was much admired and imitated by Palestrina. 1545 Franco-Flemish composer Nicolas Gombert publishes Musi Jovis, a deliberately archaic piece, as a tribute to Josquin des Prés. After 1610 Claudio Monteverdi returns to polyphony and the style antico with Missa and Illo Tempori. Circa 1742 J.S. Bach performs his arrangement of Palestrina's Missa Sine Nomine. The Protestant reformer Martin Luther influenced sacred music not only in the new Protestant churches, but also, as a result of the Counter-Reformation, in Roman Catholic rites. The Council of Trent, an ecumenical meeting of senior members of the Church in the northern Italian town of Trent between 1545 and 1563, issued guidelines for sacred music that restrained dissonance, curbed excessive ornamentation, and refined liturgical polyphony. The composer who responded most exquisitely to this new call for purity was Giovanni da Palestrina. New demands. Luther was an accomplished singer and loved music, which, together with the power of the printing press to disseminate his ideas, was key to the success of his reforms. In 1524, his first published hymn, Ein neues Lied Verhebenen, was a street ballad about the death at the stake in Brussels of two adherents to Protestant reform. Set to a familiar tune, it was far removed from the rich polyphony and instrumental brilliance of Roman Catholic music. Its simple appeal spoke directly to many who felt alienated by the Church's love of wealth and lavish ritual. Popular, accessible music became a potent vehicle for spreading ideas and rallying support, and was also the hallmark of services in the new Reformed Church. Luther and the French Protestant reformer John Calvin encouraged the singing of hymns to tunes that everyone knew. Giovanni da Palestrina. Probably born in the Italian town of Palestrina in 1525, Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina had strong family connections to nearby Rome. After his mother's death when he was about 11, he became a chorister at the city's Santa Maria Maggiore church. In his late teens, Palestrina returned to his hometown to become the organist at the cathedral. When the Bishop of Palestrina, Cardinal Giovanni Maria del Monte, was elected Pope Julius III in 1550, the composer went back to Rome as director of the Cappella Julia. He dedicated his Missa Ecce Sacerdos Magnus to Julius in 1554. The next year he gained a place in the papal choir at the Sistine Chapel and went on to hold several top musical posts. His music includes madrigals and more than 105 masses and 50 motets. Other key works: 1562 Missa Papae Marcelli, 1570 Missa Brevis, 1572 Missa Tu es Petrus, 1584 Pulchra es, 1590 Stabat Mater. Old traditions. This emphasis on simplicity was in sharp contrast to Roman Catholic practice. The less educated would have had the greatest difficulty in following the masses in a cathedral or ducal chapel of the time. This was a problem that the Roman Catholic churchman, humanist, and scholar Bernardino Cirillo recognized. In 1549 he wrote, "In our times musicians have put all their work and effort into the composition of fugues, so that while one voice sings Sanctus another has Sabbath, and yet one more sings Gloria Tua. Howling, bellowing, and stammering, they more closely resemble cats in January than flowers in May. The reform of notation in the 14th century had, for the first time, given composers the ability to set down almost any musical idea with precision. Since then, the Catholic Church had at times encouraged, and at other times censured, their tendency to embellish music and add ever-increasing degrees of complexity and subtlety. At the end of the 15th century, the daily Mass was usually sung to plainchant. However, if the institution hosting the service had the resources, the ordinary of the Mass might be treated to many varieties of embellishment. In the 1490s, several writers noted the presence of a cornet player at High Mass as part of the chapel of Philip IV of Burgundy. They do not mention what he played. His mere presence, as a wind player in the chapel, was enough to be remarkable. Wind players, who had previously improvised, began to hone their skills in reading music and accompanying such choirs, so that by the 1530s their presence at a polyphonic high mass became less unusual to congregants. While the contribution of wind players to church music would have been impressive, the resonance of a brass ensemble, if badly handled, might hinder the clear delivery of the text. The Spanish composer Francisco Guerrero encouraged his cornet players to improvise florid ornaments but to take turns, as, when they ornament together it makes such absurdities as would stop up the ears. Stabat Mater captivates the human soul. Franz Liszt. The Council of Trent met 25 times in 18 years to discuss its response to the heresies of Protestantism and to clarify Catholic doctrine and liturgy. Little thought for the text. Even when a Mass was sung as unaccompanied polyphony, the clarity of expression favored by Cirillo was not always uppermost in a composer's mind. Franco-Flemish musicians often paraded their skill in handling complex polyphonic structures and compositions of extraordinary virtuosity. In a Mass in 4 parts, for instance, certain sections might be written in the manuscript with only 3 parts notated, so that the singer had to find the 4th part by following the logic of the other 3 parts, effectively solving a riddle. The composer might make the singer's job even harder by writing canonic voices that moved at different speeds from the original. The tour de force here is Johannes Ockegem's Missa Prolationum, in which each of the 4 movements of the Mass explores a different canonic scenario. The interval separating the voices of the canon becomes progressively longer in each consecutive movement. Josquin Desprez' Missa L'Homme Armes super voces musicales provides only 1 line of music for an elegant and varied 3-voice setting of the second repeat of the Agnus Dei. The result of 3 voices singing polyphony woven from a single melody sung at different speeds is extraordinary for its audacity, but the emphasis is not on easily discernible words. Musical textures. Degrees of complexity. Renaissance composers, aided by more precise notation methods and encouraged by wealthy patrons, produced increasingly multilayered music. An official response. The Catholic Church dealt with the mounting crisis precipitated by Luther's reforms with a series of meetings to decide what the official response should be. After many delays, the council convened in the town of Trent in northern Italy in 1545. By the time of the final meeting overseen by Pope Pius IV, positions had reached a deadlock, and it was clear that reconciliation between Rome and the reformers would be impossible. Yet the Protestant reforms had forced the Roman Catholic Church to introduce changes to doctrine and practice, which included purifying its sacred music. In 1562, a resolution of the Council of Trent laid down guidelines for musicians. This stated, "All things should indeed be so ordered that the masses, whether they be celebrated with chant or chorally, may reach the ears of listeners and gently penetrate their hearts, when everything is executed clearly and at the right speed. In the case of those masses, which are celebrated with polyphony and with organ, let nothing profane be intermingled, but only hymns and divine praises." Composers needed to respond to this new directive. The Renaissance fostered the growth of personality, an idea fundamentally opposed to the selflessness and objectivity of the old polyphony. Zoe Kendrick, biographer of Palestrina. enhancing the words. Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina had published his first book of Masses in 1554 and had returned to Santa Maria Maggiore, where he had first served as a choirboy, as Maestro di Cappella in 1561. The story runs that he anticipated complete papal censure. Fearing the reduction of music and Catholic liturgy to plainchant alone, he stood ready with a Mass and 4 voices to demonstrate that polyphony could serve the text in a way that would please even the harshest critics. The Missa Papae Marcelli does appear to date from 1562, the year of the Council's resolution concerning music. It is said that the cardinals found this Mass especially pleasing, approval that gave Palestrina status as the savior of polyphony. It seems, in fact, that the Mass was probably written for Holy Week and complied with Pope Marcellus II's desire for a restrained setting that could be clearly understood in mind. Palestrina's work fulfills much of what was expected of polyphony in the era after the Council of Trent, with his targeted approach to dissonance, clarity of declamation, and refined command of polyphonic writing. Yet Palestrina did not shy away from taking the new precepts to their limits. His Missa Repleter os meum in 5 voices, published in 1570, shows complete control of the virtuoso, canonic, style favored by the Franco-Flemish composers, but with such clear handling of the text that even Cirillo might have approved. In his Canticum Canticorum, composed in 1584, an acclaimed cycle of 29 motets based on the Old Testament's Song of Solomon, Palestrina was even more daring. While he referred to it as a sacred piece, he unashamedly embraced a more passionate style, explaining in his dedication to Pope Gregory XIII that this was in keeping with its subject matter. Elsewhere in Europe, Palestrina was one bright star in a constellation of great polyphonists of the Counter-Reformation. In Spain, the Orthodox seal of Philip II encouraged a strong school of polyphonic composition in its cathedrals. Tomás Luis de Victoria, a prolific composer of sacred works, was renowned for the intense drama of his music. He had been a choirboy, an organist in Avila, before going to Rome, where he may have studied with Palestrina. Later returning to Spain, he spent most of his working life at Madrid's convent of the Descalzes Reals. The German states were greatly split in their religious allegiance. The southern principalities still adhered to Rome. Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria, a leading figure of the German Counter-Reformation, for example, employed many musicians including Orland de Lassus, a Flemish composer renowned as a child for the beauty of his singing voice. Under generous ducal patronage, Lassus directed the Hofkapelle, combining voices, violins, viols, lute, a variety of brass and woodwind instruments, and even a racket. Such a large ensemble of almost orchestral ambition would have been highly unusual for the time. If the Catholic Church looked askance at such instrumentation, its guidelines were obviously open to a degree of local interpretation. Palestrina spent 5 years as Maestro di Cappella at St. John Lateran in Rome, depicted in this 17th-century Dutch print. See also, Messe de Notre Dame Missa Lhom ar Missa Pange Lingua Spem in alium great service ein fest Berg ist unser Gott. In context. Focus. English Protestant Church music before 1558. John Shepherd composes his second service, a setting for 5 voices of the full service and precursor to Byrd's 10-voice great service. See point 1570. William Mundy composes his evening service in Medio Chori for a choir in 9 parts, expanding to 11 parts at times. After. See point 1620. Thomas Wilkes publishes Evensong for 7 voices, a great service in up to 10 parts. See point 1630. Thomas Tompkins's third or great service for 10 voices is the grandest work in the genre. Although William Byrd is believed to have been a Catholic for most, if not all, of his life, he composed music for the Anglican Church in addition to motets and masses in Latin for the Catholic Rite. He lived through 3 eras of religious revisionism in England. Under Henry VIII and then Edward VI, the country had been Protestant since 1534, but in 1553 Mary Tudor acceded to the throne with her husband Philip II of Spain and reinstated Catholicism. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth I returned England to Protestantism. However, Elizabeth was tolerant of Catholicism among the country's gentry if they were loyal and practiced it discreetly. She sanctioned the use of Latin for services at the Chapel Royal, and composers were permitted to use Latin as well as English when writing liturgical music. Byrd flourished under Elizabeth's patronage. By 1565, he was the organist and master at Lincoln Cathedral, where he produced his short service, settings for Matins, Communion, and Evensong, amounting to the greater part of music in English for the Anglican liturgy. Later, when Byrd was a gentleman of the Chapel Royal, Elizabeth granted Byrd and his fellow composer Thomas Tallis, who was also a Catholic, a monopoly on music production in England. The seeds of Protestantism in England were sown by Martin Luther, the architect of the Reformation in Germany, shown here playing music with his children. To a man thinking about divine things, the most fitting measures come, I know not how, as if by their own free will. William Byrd. God and Queen. Concern about Byrd's religious adherence did become an issue, however, in 1577, when Byrd's wife, Julian, was accused of failing to attend a service by the Bishop of London, John Aylmer, a rigorous enforcer of the Act of Uniformity of 1559, which aimed to unify the Anglican Church. From then on, Byrd did not make a secret of his Catholic faith, and the reception for the first publication of Latin, sacred songs, in 1575 was lukewarm, perhaps because of the Catholic sentiment of some of the texts. In spite of his Catholicism, Byrd's loyalty to Queen and country appears to have taken precedence over his religious adherence. In thanksgiving for the victory of the English fleet over the Spanish Armada in 1588, Elizabeth composed a song titled, "Look, and bow down thine ear, O Lord." It is thought that she chose William Byrd to set it to music. Although the anthem is now lost, it would have been a clear demonstration of her high regard for him. Last Anglican work. In 1580, Byrd published his great service, his last work for the Anglican Rite. A monumental composition, the great service comprises 7 sections for an Anglican celebration of the Mass in English for 2 5-voice choirs. It is not known if Byrd wrote his great service with any particular choir or occasion in mind. However, the sheer scale of the piece and the technical requirement of the writing would have put it beyond the reach of all but the largest choirs. Some hear it as a farewell to colleagues, or a last act of contrition to a monarch who had chosen to overlook Byrd's Catholicism. In 1605, a messenger carrying a copy of Byrd's newly published Gradualia was apprehended and thrown in Newgate jail. The composer, however, avoided imprisonment, facing only pressure in the courts and heavy fines. William Byrd. Born into a large merchant family in London in 1540, William Byrd most likely gained his musical training as one of 10 boy choristers at London's St. Paul's Church, before going on to sing for Catholic ceremonies at the Chapel Royal under Queen Mary. Later, in 1572, during Elizabeth I's reign, Byrd became a gentleman of the Chapel Royal, a post he held for more than 20 years. While Byrd composed much secular music, including works for virginals, he is best known for his religious music. In 1575, he and Thomas Tallis published a first volume of Latin motets, Canciones Sacrae. After Tallis's death, Byrd continued the series with 2 volumes of his own canciones in 1589 and 1591. Byrd published his last work, Psalms, Songs, and Sonnets in 1611, 12 years before his death in 1623. Other key works: 1589 Canciones Sacrae, Book 1 1591 Canciones Sacrae, Book 2 1605 Gradualia. See also, Missa Lhomar Missa Pange Lingua Canticum Canticorum mein Fest Berg ist unser Gott. In context. Focus Madrigals. Before 1571, Thomas Wythorne publishes Songes, the first collection of English madrigals. 1594, Thomas Morley publishes his first book of madrigals to 4 voices, the first collection to use the Italian description of the style. After 1612, Orlando Gibbons publishes his first set of madrigals and motets. It includes The Silver Swan, a short madrigal but one of the best known today. 1620, 1649, the fashion for the English madrigal waned, giving way to the lute song, and the style vanished with the establishment of the Commonwealth of England from 1649. In 1544, at a time when England was hungry for continental fashions, the composer and poet Thomas Wythorne toured Europe and wrote sonnets that he later set to music in songs, the first book of English madrigals. In Italy, the masters of the madrigal style included Philippe Verdelot and Jacob Arcadelt, whose works appeared in the earliest book of Italian madrigals, published in Rome in 1530. In 1588, Nicholas Young published his Musica Transalpina, a collection of Italian madrigals reworked with English texts, whetting an appetite for homegrown songs sung in parts. Madrigal. Music made upon songs and sonnets. To men of understanding most delightful. Thomas Morley. Illustrating the words. Many English collections followed, often arranged for voices and viols to satisfy a growing middle-class taste for after-dinner music making. In 1595, Thomas Morley introduced the ballette, a rustic madrigal with a fa la la chorus in imitation of an instrumental refrain. Thomas Weelkes, among others, began to use musical effects to illustrate the text, known as word painting. In O Care, Thou Wilt Dispatch Me, Weelkes describes the poet's disturbed state of mind in sliding semitones at odds with the cheerful fa la la refrain. In Italy, the madrigals of Carlo Gesualdo da Venosa use extreme harmonic shifts and dissonance to paint words, while the Madrigali Guerrieri et Amorosi of Claudio Monteverdi lift the form to theatrical heights. See also, Le Jeu de Robin et de Marion Musique de Table di Sean Mullerin. In context. Focus. Renaissance wind bands before. Circa 1480, a choir book prepared as a gift for Isabella d'Este on the occasion of her marriage, contains part of the repertoire of the wind ensemble of the Duke of Ferrara, one of the most accomplished of the day. 1582, Florencio Maschera publishes the first collection of canzoni, Italian instrumental pieces for violins, or cornets and sackbuts. After 1585, 1598, Venetian cornetist Giovanni Bassano publishes his book of passaggi, virtuosic ornamented versions of motets and popular songs. 1661, in England, the Sagbutts and Cornets of the Royal Wind Music play suites by Matthew Locke for the coronation of Charles II. The Basilica of St. Mark's in Venice provides a dramatic setting for composers exploring instrumental timbre and the use of space. The Flemish composer Adrian Willaert was the first to exploit its potential when he became musical director there in 1527. His Cori Spezzati style divided the ensemble around the galleries, giving performances a greater theatricality. Learning the Cori Spezzati style from Willaert, Andrea Gabrielli, appointed organist of St. Mark's in 1566, and his nephew Giovanni Gabrielli, employed the Venetian ensembles of Pifferi both to reinforce a vocal ensemble or for purely instrumental purposes. Renaissance recorders were often used to accompany songs. This image from Musica Getouched, a treatise on music theory by Sebastian Verdum, illustrates fingering on the instrument. Dramatic impact. In the past, civic trumpeters had mostly just sounded the curfew and played for dances. As Renaissance cities and nation-states jostled for power, the role of their instrumentalists became more important. Music making of the highest order was encouraged, and in this Venice became preeminent. Giovanni Gabrielli's Sonata Piani Forte, for 6 trombones, a cornet, and a viola da braccio, was the first work for specific brass instruments and the first to include dynamic indications of loudness and softness for the players, adding dramatic light and shade effects. In the shimmering shadows of St. Mark's, such an intense sonata might accompany the consecration of the host. See also, Canticum Canticorum Water Music, the Four Seasons Street Matthew Passion Elijah. In context. Focus. Renaissance instrumental music before 1507. Francesco Spinacino's Intabulatura del Lato is published in Venice, the first printed collections for solo lute. 1545. The appointment of Mark Anthony Gayardel and George de Combe, violins, as court musicians marks the debut of the violin in England. After 1611. Giovanni Girolamo Capsberger publishes his Libro Primo di Intabulatura del Lato, music for the theorbo, a lute with an extended neck to hold additional bass strings. Circa 1630. English composer John Jenkins produces his pavans and nominees for viol consort in up to 6 parts, continuing an English interest in music for viol consort that lasts into the time of Henry Purcell. Musical instruments developed rapidly from the late 14th century onward, as musicians refined their skills and emulated court style to attract patronage. The first organ with pedals and 12-note chromatic keyboard was recorded in the German town of Halberstadt in 1361. Around 1440, while working in the Burgundian court, Dutch organist Arnaud van Zwolle drew a diagram of the earliest harpsichord, with keys that lifted vertical pieces of wood, called jacks, fitted with plectrums that then pluck strings. Zwolle also described the dulce melas, a keyboard instrument in which the strings were struck by metal mallets, the earliest recorded use of a piano-style action. Blame not my lute, for he must sound of this or that as liketh me, for lack of wit with the lute is bound to give such tunes as pleaseth me. Thomas Wyatt. The rise of the lute. Beyond these innovations, the more portable lute evolved to become the emblematic instrument of the Renaissance. Pietro Bono, a much-fated musician to the Este family of Ferrara around 1450-1470, had played virtuosic streams of melody with a quill plectrum, while an accompanist called a tenorista played the slow, accompanying lower parts on another lute. The addition of gut frets, tied around the neck of the lute, facilitated left-hand speed and accuracy. A more significant stylistic change occurred when the lutenist put down the plectrum. Stroking the strings with the thumb and fingers of the right hand, the soloist could play all the voices of a polyphonic piece. By the late 15th century, the lute was no longer simply the companion of minstrels but had moved to the heart of court music and composition. The 16th century lute at first had 6 courses, then gained extra courses in the bass called diapasons, tuned diatonically. Renaissance consort instruments, including the lute and strings, are shown in Hearing, a collaboration between Jan Bruegel the Elder and Paul Rubens. The English connection. By the turn of the 17th century, John Dowland was one of a number of composers who were writing for a lute with 9 courses. England excelled in the new style of lute playing, which was also popular with amateur players, including Elizabeth I, who is shown playing the instrument in a miniature painted by Nicholas Hilliard. Dowland composed around 90 works for the lute alone but also incorporated the instrument into a wider ensemble, known as a consort. His collection Lacrimi develops the composer's own Lacrimi pavan, a dance with stately music often treated to instrumental elaboration, to create 7 melancholy variations, scored for a string ensemble with solo lute. Renaissance ensembles usually comprised consorts of the same instrument, but Dowland imagined for his Lacrimi pavans either 6 viols or 6 violins, including the bass violin, forerunner of the cello. Dances like the pavan and the triple-time galliard were used by keyboard players and composers to show their skill at improvisation, usually playing divisions on the repeat of a section. My Lady Novelle's book by the English composer William Byrd contains 10 pavan, galliard pairs with variations for the virginal, an instrument related to the harpsichord. John Dowland. It has been variously claimed that Dowland was born in 1563 in Westminster or Dalkey, and his early life remains obscure. He spent his late teens in service to the English ambassador in France, where he embraced Catholicism, later claiming that this conversion prevented his appointment as lutenist at the English royal court in 1594. Dowland then set off for 3 years on a European tour, before finding an appreciative patron in Christian IV of Denmark. The relationship later soured, and Dowland was dismissed in 1606. Although his son, the composer and lutenist Robert Dowland, described his father in 1610 as being now grey and like the swan, but singing toward his end, Dowland was, within 2 years, made one of the lutenists of King James I of England and Scotland. Between that appointment and his death, in 1625, few compositions survive. Other key works: 1597 First Book of Songes or Airs, 1612 A Pilgrim's Solace. See also, Le Jeu de Robin et de Marion Gabrielli Sonata piano forte Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme Stamets Symphony in E-flat major. Introduction. The Baroque period of music started dramatically, with the performance of the world's first opera, Jacopo Peri's Daphne, staged in Florence in 1598. The opera illustrates the dramatic change in musical style from polyphony to something more expressive, a change exploited to great effect in Monteverdi's Vespers, which contrasts sections in the old and new styles. Key developments. One of the main features of the early Baroque period, and one that must have been startling at the time, was a rejection of polyphony in favor of a single line of melody with a simple accompaniment. This monody, as it was called, was an attempt to reproduce the style of classical Greek drama. The accompaniment was of particular significance. In the recitative sections of early opera, the freely composed expositions of the plot that connected the arias, the voice was accompanied by a single bass instrument, such as a cello, and an instrument capable of playing chords, such as a harpsichord or lute. This accompaniment, known as the basso continuo, or simply continuo, became a key feature of music in the early Baroque period. The importance of the continuo was that it provided a harmonic base for the melody. While Renaissance music had been characterized by polyphony, the new style was defined by harmony. In place of interweaving melodies based on the ancient Greek scales or modes, early Baroque composers built their music on major and minor chords. Dramatic and contrasting effects were achieved by varying the loudness and tempo, moving the music between keys and instruments, and sometimes adding embellishments such as trills. The revolutionary new style and the idea of a drama set to music proved very popular, especially among the aristocracy in Italy and France, who employed a staff of musicians and a resident composer to provide entertainment in the courts. In addition to operas, they performed instrumental music, and in the royal court at Versailles, Jean-Baptiste Lully assembled an orchestra to provide incidental music and dances for the performance of the latest comedies by playwrights such as Molière. This form of light entertainment caught on elsewhere and influenced the development of the musical drama known as a masque in England. Since the Reformation, opera had been frowned upon by Protestants, and in the Germanic countries, musical activity was largely restricted to the church. Gradually, though, a distinctly German Baroque style, very different from the Italian and French, evolved from the chorale, the hymn tunes of the Lutheran Church, uniting the harmonic treatment of the new style of vocal music with some elements of the old Italian polyphony. This hybrid style was more suited to the Northern European temperament, and soon became accepted into Protestant church music. It inspired the development of the instrumental chorale prelude, a sometimes florid setting of a chorale melody, usually for organ. High and Late Baroque. As time passed, many elements of the early Baroque period disappeared. By about 1700, the period referred to as the High Baroque had begun. What had been a small accompanying group for opera singers had taken on a life of its own as an orchestra of stringed, woodwind, and brass instruments, playing a new form of music, the concerto grosso, made popular by Arcangelo Corelli and Antonio Vivaldi. The continuo, while still acting as the harmonic backbone of the orchestra, had also become an independent chamber ensemble, playing a form of music known as the trio sonata. Opera itself had been hijacked, appearing instead as unstaged choral works such as the secular cantata and the sacred oratorio. The late Baroque period was dominated by three composers born in Germany in 1685. The first, George Philipp Telemann, is often overshadowed by his contemporaries, but was by far the most prolific. The second was George Friedrich Handel, a populist who made his name in England with his oratorios and orchestral music. The third, regarded by musicians as the greatest of the three, was Johann Sebastian Bach, a conservative composer but a consummate craftsman. During a lifetime of employment by courts and the church, Bach's sacred and secular music represented the high point of the Baroque period. In context. Focus: early opera. Before. C. 700 BC. Ancient Greek drama incorporates music. Greek myth identifies Orpheus as the father of songs. 1598. Peri collaborates with Jacopo Corsi on La Daphne, the first opera, to a libretto by Ottavio Rinuccini, staged at the Palazzo Corsini, Florence. After 1607. Monteverdi's first opera, L'Orfeo, is staged in Mantua. 1637. The first public opera house, the Teatro San Cassiano in Venice, opens with Francesco Minelli's L'Andromeda. 1640. Monteverdi composes Il Ritorno di Ulisse in Patria, his first opera written for a public theatre in Venice. The conditions for the birth of opera were right in Florence in the 1590s. Large-scale theatrical entertainments utilizing music, known as intermedi, often performed as interludes during spoken plays, were commissioned for dynastic celebrations, such as weddings and baptisms. Their musical sections, songs, dances, and choruses, were themselves interspersed with spoken dialogue. It was the introduction of recitative, the art of speaking in song, that defined opera. Florentine intellectual societies, most notably the Camerata de' Bardi, which met at the house of patron, playwright, and composer Giovanni de' Bardi, had included in their humanist debates discussions about the nature of Greek drama, which they concluded was sung throughout. Peri wrote La Daphne with composer Jacopo Corsi and poet Ottavio Rinuccini in an attempt to revive this practice. Orpheus and Eurydice climb out of the underworld in Edward Poynter's painting of 1862. The Greek myth was a particularly apt subject for opera because Orpheus was a musician. Elements of opera. While only fragments of La Daphne exist today, Peri's second work, Eurydice, survives intact. The libretto of Eurydice tells the Greek myth of Orpheus, who enters the underworld to retrieve his wife Eurydice after her death from snakebite. Eurydice offers the standard intermedio combination of songs alternating with choruses and instrumental passages, but these are linked by recitatives, the new style of sung speech. In his preface to the work, Peri described his intention of imitating speech with song, which was the bedrock of the new genre. He also listed some of the instruments played in the original production, such as harpsichord, chitarrone, violin, lyre, and lute, although other instruments may also have been used. The performance included sections composed by Peri's rival at court, Giulio Caccini, who had trained several of the singers. Caccini even made his own musical setting of the libretto and had it printed prior to Peri's. The publication of these scores ensured the opera's survival. It creates a coherent world, highly charged with a distinctive atmosphere. It is simple without being vapid, and dignified without being portentous. Stephen Oliver. Singing his works composed with the greatest artifice. Moved and disposed every stony heart to tears. Severo Bonini. In Peri's footsteps. The new form represented by Eurydice was repeated in Florence and emulated elsewhere. In Mantua in 1607, Claudio Monteverdi, master of music at the city's ducal court, produced L'Orfeo, which is regarded as the first operatic masterpiece. Monteverdi later composed 3 further works for the Venetian opera houses, Illinois Ritorno di Ulisse in Patria, L'Incoronazione di Poppaea, and one now lost, exemplifying the new style. Soon Monteverdi's followers, such as Francesco Cavalli and Antonio Sesti, were producing operas in Italy and abroad, with the basic construction blocks of recitatives and arias holding the structure together. Jacopo Peri. Born into a noble family in 1561, Jacopo Peri grew up in Florence. As a teenager, he played the organ and sang at various churches and monasteries in the city before beginning